The gender ideology debate and the latest developments and key factual, ethical and cultural issues shaping it. Welcome back to Riks Europe. Jo Bartosch, journalist with Words in Spiked, Telegraph, The Times, to name a few, assistant editor at the Critic, and you've also recently co-written a book on pornography called Pornocracy.
Yes, that's right.
That correct?
Yeah.
So you had written a text for Spiked, how the Cass Review changes everything, and it's of course referring to gender ideology and the Cass Review. Could you just tell us briefly, again, introducing the audience to the Cass Review and the ultimate goal?
Yeah, of course. So it was proposed by the previous Prime Minister, and it was because there have been a number of legal cases from detransitioners. So we've had Kira Bell, she was the most notable detransitioner, and basically as a young traumatised, she's a bisexual, as a young traumatised bisexual woman, she believed she was born in the wrong body, and she wasn't challenged on this thinking, and then she was referred to the Sanderford Clinic, actually, which is another one of the gender identity clinics, and she was Tavistock, and they encouraged her basically to transition without offering any proper therapy. And within a few appointments, she'd been put on testosterone and underwent a mastectomy. So now, as a young woman, she's been left without any breasts. She doesn't know about the impact on her fertility, and she has facial hair because of the hormones that she was put on. So she's just one of many young people who were put on this medical path without any proper scrutiny, without any proper evidence, and it was all based on one Dutch study, which was flawed in itself, which suggested that if you affirm children who believe they're in the wrong body or in the wrong sex, that eases their mental suffering. And the Cass Review has fundamentally shown that that's not true, and that the evidence base is weak, and that's why the Tavistock Clinic has now been shut. There are bridging services for young adults before they get referred to adult services. And there's now an investigation of adult services as well. So it has been quite a fundamental change to the way that young people are treated for what's known as gender dysphoria.
And the text mentions how the Cass Review highlights significant shortcomings in the evidence base for medical interventions in gender identity services. Could you tell us, in your view, what have been the most critical factual gaps and misrepresentations that have shaped the public and professional understanding on this issue?
Yeah, so for a long time, there's been a concerted effort by trans lobby groups to attach themselves to lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. But actually, what's understood as being transgender, which used to be called transsexualism, is an adult male fetish. And the reason it has been, it's been sort of desexed, if you like. So to take it away from the idea of being a fetish, they moved from the word transsexual to the word transgender. And then lots of children, there's been a crisis in youth mental health. And I think in part that's probably driven by social media and pornography and just the online world. So young people were being coached online by influencers into believing that their feelings of sort of typical adolescence, of feeling uncomfortable in their bodies, was evidence of them potentially being born in the wrong body. And it particularly affected girls, and it has become a social contagion, and it's something that's happened all over the world. And rather than sort of urging caution or looking into it, the NHS within the UK had partnered effectively with groups like Mermaids, who are a trans lobby group, with Stonewall, and they were deferred to as the authorities. But of course, they're ideological, not evidence-based, not medically based. They've got no clinical experience, yet they had a hand in shaping the treatments that were offered to this particularly vulnerable cohort of young people. So basically, we've seen a mass sort of medical sterilisation, and it has particularly impacted upon same-sex attracted young people. So people who might grow up to be same-sex attracted are more likely to exhibit behaviours that are considered stereotypically associated with the opposite sex. Now, that was the diagnostic criteria that was then used to suggest that they were in some way transgender. So it's been a huge scandal. It's been there were whistleblowers within the Tavistock who tried to draw attention to this going back 20 years. And they've been pushed out, they've been dismissed, they've been bullied, they've been called transphobes. And finally, the truth is starting to emerge. And it's starting to emerge, I think, really because detransitioners, young people like Kira Bell, are starting to come out of the woodwork and say, actually, we needed help and what we were given were drugs.
Something you mentioned there was the ideological bias. Could you explain more about that?
Yeah, so I think it was sort of done for the best of intentions. So I think a lot of clinicians and psychiatrists, they're as easily influenced by social trends as anyone else. And you had these sort of very powerful lobby groups basically bullying them, suggesting that they were being unkind, telling journalists, producing style guides for journalists, saying if they used incorrect pronouns, then transgender people would kill themselves, all sorts of nonsense like this. And it very quickly became embedded, partly because people wanted to be kind and do the right thing, and partly because organisations like Stonewall in particular set up schemes whereby, like the BBC and government departments, could show that they were that they had been trained, that they had a good attitude towards LGBT, as it's called, issues. And they then sort of influenced the policies. So they vetted the policies that organisations, internal policies that organisations had. So that impacted on things like the style guides that journalists use, quite a fundamental change. What toilets, for example, I know it sounds like a minor thing, but what toilets staff use. And there are ongoing cases at the moment within the NHS whereby nurses, female nurses, have been forced to share changing rooms with men who say that they're women. So that's there are 3 ongoing cases that I know of around those. So there were 5 nurses called the Darlington Five who are challenging the NHS on this at the moment. And they were all disciplined and told that they needed to broaden their minds and learn about trans issues, rather than their managers actually looking and saying, well, why does this man believe he's a woman? And why does he think it's acceptable to share a changing room with them? He'd made quite inappropriate comments and or was alleged to have. And he hasn't had any surgery or anything. So he's a fully intact man who just insisted on sharing their changing room. And that was accepted because he said he was trans, and it was accepted because the organisation for which they all worked had been trained by these lobby groups. So it was really a question of lobby groups going into publicly owned and privately owned organisations and sort of setting themselves up as the authorities.
And there's been a growing number of critical voices of gender ideology, and this particular article or text is sort of predicting how this debate will be developing during 2025, now with the new year. Could you tell us a little bit about significant developments?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most significant development probably is something that's happened today. The inauguration of Donald Trump. And, I've never been particularly a supporter of his, yet at the same time, one of his first actions has been to restore Title IX. So that means that in the US, a lot of the what are currently mixed-sex spaces, so prisons, hospital wards, schools, where there were previously separated, sex-segregated spaces, that looks like it's going to be restored. So basically women will have their own private space to be away from men who, on average, are more likely to be violent. So that offers some protection. And I think that sort of return to sanity, if you like, with regard to that is something that will be significant and will be felt around the world. interestingly, Biden on his first day in office passed an executive order, meaning that what was previously understood as sex would be taken to be legally understood as gender identity, meaning effectively that men had the right to identify into women's spaces. So I think that change is going to be particularly significant. More widely, I think as more evidence comes out about the harms to young people, in particular from gender ideology, and law, there are several legal cases ongoing in the States in particular, and I think it's such a litigious culture and such a risk-averse culture there. I think once the tide changes on the treatments offered to young people there, I think it'll ripple across the world.
Thank you very much, Jo Bartosch, journalist with words in Spike, The Telegraph, The Times, to name a few, and assistant editor at The Critic, and co-written a book named Pornocracy as well. And thank you for watching Riks Europe.